I couldn't wait to see you.
She gave a lost stranger a ride home. Hours later, the Mafia boss knocked on her door. You don't survive this city by opening your door to strangers, but at 2 in the afternoon, a knock rattled the cheap hinges of Maren Cole's apartment, hard enough to shake dust from the frame. She looked through the peephole. A bespoke suit stood in her dingy hallway, tailored to cost more than her entire life insurance payout. Not a cop's slouch. This man stood like he owned the concrete beneath his feet. 12 hours earlier, she'd pulled her dying Honda into reverse for a shivering child, huddled beneath a bus shelter in a storm. She had no idea whose son she'd just driven home. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments, because what happens next is going to leave you speechless. Like, share, notifications on. You are not ready for this story. The clock on the dashboard of Maren's Honda Civic read 3:14 in the morning. The numbers flickered, a symptom of a dying alternator she couldn't afford to replace. Rain lashed against the windshield in violent sheets, the worn wiper blade smearing the water rather than clearing it. Maren was numb. A 12-hour shift at St. Jude's emergency room had drained whatever reserves of empathy she had left. She smelled of cheap institutional coffee, iodine, and the faint metallic tang of blood that never quite washed out of her scrubs. She just wanted her bed. She wanted the heavy, dreamless sleep of the overworked and underpaid. She took the turn onto Delmore Avenue, a desolate stretch of road that bordered the industrial district. The streetlights here were mostly shot out, leaving only her headlights to cut through the gloom. That was when she saw him. It was just a shape at first, a small silhouette huddled beneath the rusted awning of a defunct bus stop. Maren's foot tapped the brake pedal instinctively, her tires hissing on the wet asphalt. She squinted through the smeared glass. It was a kid. He couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. He was sitting on the wet concrete bench, knees pulled to his chest, wearing a dark blue jacket soaked through and plastered to his thin frame. Maren cursed aloud. The sound was sharp in the quiet of the car. She told herself to keep driving. Call child services. Call the cops. Let someone else deal with it. She was off the clock. She didn't press the gas. She looked at the boy in the rearview mirror as she rolled past, seeing the way his shoulders shook against the cold. Cops in this city took an hour to respond to a non-lethal call in this neighborhood. By then, the kid would be hypothermic. She threw the car into reverse. The transmission ground in protest. Maren rolled the passenger window down an inch. The freezing rain immediately spat into the cabin. "Hey," she called out. The boy didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his face was pale, almost translucent. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, but it was his eyes that made Maren's breath hitch. They weren't the eyes of a lost, panicked child. They were flat, calm, utterly empty of fear. "Where are your parents?" Maren asked, projecting her nurse voice over the storm. Firm, but safe. The boy stared at her. He didn't speak. "You can't stay out here." She unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. I'll turn the heater up." For a long moment, the boy calculated. He looked up the empty street, then back to the idling car. Without a word, he slid off the bench, walked to the car, and opened the door. He climbed into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of wet wool and freezing rain with him. He shut the door softly. Most kids slammed it. He didn't. "I'm Maren." She cranked the heat dial. The vents groaned, blowing lukewarm air. "What's your name?" "Leo." His voice was remarkably steady. No trembling. "Okay, Leo. Do you know your address or a phone number? I can take you to the precinct. They can call." "No police." His tone wasn't a childish plea. It was a directive. "Take me to 400 Crestview Drive." Maren paused, her hand hovering over the gear shift. Crestview Drive. It was a private road up in the northern hills, a gated community where the houses looked like fortresses, and the property taxes cost more than St. Jude's annual operating budget. It was a 40-minute drive in the wrong direction. Leo, that's really far. How did you get all the way down here? Leo looked straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. I walked. Maren looked down. The boy was missing a shoe. His left foot was clad only in a muddy, soaked sock. The realization hit her with a dull thud. He had walked miles in this storm. Something was deeply wrong. I have to report this, Leo. Her voice softened. You're freezing, and you're missing a shoe. Someone is going to be looking for you. Leo finally turned to look at her. My father is looking for me. If you take me to the police, the men who left me here will find me first. Take me to Crestview. Please. A cold prickle traveled down Maren's spine. The rational part of her brain, the part that kept her alive and employed, screamed at her to drive straight to the nearest precinct, drag the kid inside and walk away. But looking at the bruised, soaked child beside her, the nurse in her overruled the cynic. Seatbelt, Maren muttered, shifting into drive. The drive was agonizingly silent. Maren focused on the treacherous roads, hydroplaning twice on the flooded highway. Leo didn't sleep. He sat rigidly upright, his dark eyes scanning the side mirrors, watching the headlights of the few cars that passed them. He was hyper-vigilant. When they finally reached the northern hills, the city's grit gave way to manicured lawns and towering oak trees. The road wound sharply upward, ending at a massive set of wrought iron gates flanked by stone pillars. A security camera with a glowing red lens swiveled toward her Honda as she pulled up. Before Maren could roll down her window to speak to the intercom, the heavy metal gates began to part, gliding open silently. Stop here, Leo said. Maren hit the brakes. I'm not leaving you at the gate, Leo. Let me drive you up to the door. No. Leo unbuckled his seatbelt. You shouldn't come inside. It's better if they don't see your car. He opened the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind was biting. He stepped out onto the pristine driveway, his one bare foot hitting the wet stone. Before closing the door, he looked back at her. Thank you, Maren. Wait. She reached into her scrub pocket. She pulled out a foil-wrapped granola bar, her dinner, and tossed it to him. He caught it with one hand. Then he shut the door and walked past the gates, swallowed by the shadows of the massive estate beyond. Maren watched until the gates clicked shut. She threw the car into reverse and drove home, shivering in the damp chill of the cabin. She told herself she did a good deed. She told herself the kid was safe now. She told herself she would forget about it by morning. She was wrong about all of it. Maren woke to the sound of violence against wood. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. It didn't sound like Mrs. Gable from next door complaining about the plumbing. It sounded like someone trying to break the door off its frame. She jolted upright, instantly tangled in her cheap, thin sheets. The digital clock by her bed read 2:10 p.m. She'd managed barely 5 hours of sleep. Her head throbbed, a dull ache behind her eyes. The knocking came again, 3 sharp, deliberate strikes. Maren slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy metal flashlight she kept on the nightstand. She padded quietly across the scuffed linoleum of her living room, clutching the flashlight like a club. Her apartment was small, cramped, smelling faintly of old books and dust. She pressed her eye to the peephole. Her breath stopped. There were 2 men in the narrow, dingy hallway of her complex. The man standing slightly behind was built like a cinder block, his neck thick, his eyes scanning the corridor. But it was the man at the front who commanded all the oxygen. He was tall, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that looked entirely alien against the peeling yellow wallpaper of the hallway. His face was sharp, angular, and violently handsome in a way that offered no comfort. His eyes were dark, shadowed, fixed directly on the peephole, as if he could see right through the glass and into her skull. Maren's grip on the flashlight tightened. She knew the faces of gangbangers, junkies, and corner boys. She stitched them up every weekend. This man was none of those. He was the apex predator they all reported to. He didn't knock again. He simply waited, He knew she was there. Slowly, her hands trembling just a fraction, Maren unlocked the deadbolt and unslid the chain. She opened the door 3 inches, keeping her foot wedged firmly behind it. Can I help you?" Her voice came out raspier from sleep than she intended. Man looked at her. He took in her oversized t-shirt, her messy hair, the white-knuckle grip on the doorframe, and the heavy flashlight partially hidden behind her leg. His expression didn't change. It was a mask of cold stone. Maren Cole. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her chest. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dominic Cade." The name meant nothing to her, and the slight flicker of irritation in the cinder-block man's eyes told her it probably should have. "Okay, Dominic, what do you want?" Dominic didn't push the door. He didn't try to intimidate her physically. His mere presence did the heavy lifting. "At 3:30 this morning, a silver Honda Civic registered in your name pulled up to the gates of my home. My son stepped out of it." Maren froze. "Leo." The adrenaline spiked, hot and fast in her veins. "Is he okay?" she blurted out, the nurse in her overriding the instinct to lie and play dumb. For a fraction of a second, the cold mask cracked. A muscle feathered in Dominic's jaw. The momentary flash of raw paternal vulnerability was jarring, before it was instantly buried under ice again. "He is well," Dominic said quietly. "He had a fractured rib, minor contusions and mild hypothermia. The physician has tended to him." "Good," Maren breathed, her shoulders dropping a fraction. "That's good. Why didn't you call the police?" The question was sharp, accusatory. Maren narrowed her eyes, her defensive walls slamming back up. "He asked me not to. He said the men who left him there would find him first." She stared Dominic down, refusing to be cowed in her own doorway. "Given the neighborhood I found him in, and given that you're standing here instead of a detective, I'm guessing he was right." Silence stretched between them. The larger man shifted his weight, his leather jacket creaking. Dominic raised a hand, a microscopic gesture that froze his man instantly. "You took a significant risk." Dominic's dark eyes catalogued the peeling paint of her apartment, the cheap locks. "My son was taken from a vehicle 3 blocks from where you found him. The men who took him are dead, but my son managed to slip away during the altercation. He walked for 3 hours in the storm. Had you not stopped, he would not have made it through the night, so you're here to say thank you." Maren's tone came out dry. "You're welcome. Now, if you don't mind, I have another shift in 6 hours, and I'd like to sleep." She moved to close the door. Dominic placed a hand flat against the wood. He didn't shove it, but the immovable weight of him stopped the door dead. Maren glared at the hand, then up at his face. "I do not leave debts unpaid, Miss Cole." His voice was quieter now, dropping to a register that felt incredibly dangerous. "You saved my blood. That requires compensation." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. Maren tensed, her grip tightening on the flashlight, but he only withdrew a pristine white envelope. He held it out through the crack in the door. It was thick. Maren looked at the envelope, then at Dominic. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. "No." Dominic's hand remained steady. "It is a token of my gratitude. It will cover a new car, a better apartment in a safer district. Take it. I don't want your money." Maren's voice came out flat. "I didn't pick up a kid in the rain for a payout, and I definitely don't want money from a man who sends armed guards to drop off a thank you note. Keep it." Dominic tilted his head, studying her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't anticipated solving today. "Pride is a luxury in this city, Miss Cole. Are you sure you can afford it? I can afford to sleep with a clear conscience." She snapped. She pushed against the door again. "We're done here. I'm glad Leo is safe. Don't come back." Dominic stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He slowly withdrew his hand from the door. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a dark gleam of genuine interest in his eyes. He reached into a different pocket and pulled out a small, matte black card with nothing but a phone number embossed on it in silver. He wedged it into the seam of her door frame. When you realize that your conscience does not pay your rent or protect you from the dark, call that number, Dominic said. He turned and walked down the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing on the scuffed floorboards. The bodyguard threw Maren a long, hard look before following. Maren locked the door, slid the chain, and backed away. She stared at the black card wedged in the doorframe. She didn't touch it. She went back to bed, but the sleep she desperately needed never came. The emergency room at St. Jude's was a war zone on Friday nights. Maren moved through the chaos with practiced detachment. She checked a laceration in bed 4, administered a heavy dose of Narcan in bed 7, and dodged a projectile-vomiting drunk in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale yellow hue over the misery. It was 11:30 p.m. She hadn't stopped moving since her shift began. She stood at the nurse's station charting notes with a cheap ballpoint pen, her mind aggressively trying to stay focused on the mundane. She had left the black card exactly where Dominic Cade put it, wedged in the doorframe. She wanted nothing to do with it. She wanted to pretend the knock had never happened. "Cole," barked Dr. Aris, a grizzled trauma surgeon who looked like he slept in his scrubs. "Gunshot incoming. 10 minutes out. East Side gang dispute, looks like. Get Trauma Bay 1 ready." "On it," Maren said, dropping her pen. 10 minutes later, the double doors blew open. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a gurney carrying a young man whose chest was heavily bandaged, bright crimson soaking through the gauze. The smell of copper and unwashed sweat hit the air. 22-year-old male, 2 GSWs to the upper right quadrant. The paramedic shouted over the din. "BP is dropping, 80 over 50. Lost a lot of blood in the alley." Maren fell into rhythm, moving to the side of the gurney ready with the IV lines. As they transferred the patient to the trauma bed, the doors blew open again. 3 men stormed in. They weren't paramedics. They wore baggy clothes, bandanas, and the wild, panicked eyes of men running on adrenaline and meth. The leader, a wiry guy with a neck tattoo of a scorpion, shoved a security guard against the wall. "Where is he? Where's Marcus?" the guy screamed, looking around the ER. He spotted the bloody gurney in Trauma Bay 1. "That's him. Let me through." "Sir, you cannot be back here," Dr. Aris commanded, stepping in front of the bay. The wiry man didn't hesitate. He pulled a heavy black handgun from his waistband and pointed it directly at Dr. Aris's chest. "Step the hell aside, Doc. He owes us." The ER went dead silent. The screaming drunk stopped. The crying child hushed. The only sound was the rhythmic, frantic beeping of the heart monitor attached to the dying man on the table. Maren froze, her hands gripping a bag of saline. She looked at the gun, her heart hammered against her ribs, loud and painful. The gunman took a step forward. I said, "Move." Maren calculated the distance. She was out of the line of fire, but Aris was dead center. There were no cops in the lobby. They had been called out to a riot down the street. Before Aris could move, before the gunman could pull the trigger, the electronic doors to the ER slid open with a soft, mundane whoosh. 2 men walked in. They weren't wearing baggy clothes. They wore dark, tailored suits. One was the cinderblock man from Maren's hallway. The other was slightly taller, his jacket unbuttoned. They walked into the chaotic, terrified ER as if they were strolling through a park. The gunman spun around, raising his weapon. "Back the hell up." The cinderblock man didn't blink. He didn't even break stride. His hand moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out, grabbed the barrel of the gun, forced it upward, and drove the palm of his other hand into the gunman's nose with a sickening crack. The gunman dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The other 2 gang members froze. The second suit stepped forward, revealing a suppressed pistol tucked neatly against his side. Shielded from the view of the waiting room by his body, he didn't point it. He just looked at the 2 young men. "Leave," the suit said quietly. The 2 gang members looked at their unconscious leader on the floor, bleeding onto the linoleum, then turned and sprinted out the doors. The cinder-block man casually kicked the dropped handgun under a row of chairs. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes scanning the room. The terrified nurses and doctors stared in shock. The man's eyes found Maren. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just held her gaze for 2 seconds. A clear, undeniable message. We see you. We are watching. Then he reached down, hoisted the unconscious gunman by the scruff of his jacket, and dragged him out the sliding doors. The ER remained paralyzed for 5 long seconds before Dr. Harris snapped out of it. Cole, push the fluids now. Maren jolted, her hands shaking as she attached the saline bag to the IV. She went through the motions, assisting in stabilizing the gunshot victim, but her mind was miles away. She realized then what Dominic Cade's visit truly meant. He hadn't come to just offer her money, he had come to claim her. By saving his son, she had stepped into his ecosystem. The black card in her doorframe wasn't an offer of help, it was a brand. When her shift ended at 7 a.m., Maren walked out into the crisp morning air. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She walked to her beat-up Honda, sitting perfectly centered on her windshield. Pinned under the wiper blade was a single, flawless white rose. No note, no ribbon, just the flower. Maren stood in the empty parking lot, staring at it. The cold reality washed over her, heavier than the exhaustion in her bones. She hadn't just given a lost kid a ride home. She had invited a ghost into her life. And ghosts, she knew, never left you alone. Maren threw the white rose into the hospital parking lot garbage can. It landed softly on top of a discarded foam coffee cup and a pile of damp napkins. She drove home in silence, the heater barely fighting the morning chill. When she reached her apartment, she finally pulled the black card from the seam of her doorframe. She didn't call the number. She dropped it into the kitchen trash right over a layer of eggshells and coffee grounds. She wanted her life back. She wanted the mundane, crushing exhaustion of double shifts and late rent. She didn't want white roses or silent men in tailored suits. For 3 days, the universe seemed to comply. St. Jude's was its usual brand of chaotic. Her Honda kept stalling at red lights, and her neighbors kept arguing through the thin walls. Normalcy settled over her like a heavy, suffocating, but familiar blanket. What Maren didn't know during those 3 quiet days was that a considerably more dangerous story was unfolding entirely without her. Across the city, inside the fortified estate on Crestview Drive, Dominic Cade sat across from his longtime second-in-command in a private study lined with dark wood and untouched books. Sergei Volkov had served at Dominic's side for over a decade, present at every major decision, every negotiation, every quiet moment of vulnerability Dominic had allowed himself across 15 years of building an empire. He was the one man Dominic trusted with everything. The investigation into Julian's kidnapping continued. Sergei's report, every morning. We've traced the vehicle used in the abduction, stolen 3 days prior from a parking structure downtown. No plates that lead anywhere useful. Whoever planned this was careful. Dominic's jaw remained tight. Someone knew our route that morning. Someone knew exactly when Julian's security detail would be thinnest. Sergei's expression carried the specific practiced concern of a man delivering bad news he'd already anticipated needing to deliver. I've already begun reviewing internal personnel. If there's a leak, we'll find it. Dominic nodded, trusting the process. Trusting the man in front of him with the same absolute certainty he'd trusted him for a decade. What Dominic didn't see, what nobody in that study noticed, was the specific, practiced ease with which Sergei steered every conversation away from certain names, certain timelines, certain financial records that would have, under any genuine scrutiny, exposed exactly who had orchestrated the entire operation from the very beginning. Sergei had been positioning for years. watching Dominic's territory expand, watching his own position remain permanently second, calculating the exact vulnerable window where Dominic's guard would drop low enough for an outside strike to succeed. And Julian's kidnapping had never been about ransom money at all. It had been about creating exactly the kind of catastrophic grief and operational distraction that would let Sergei quietly consolidate control while Dominic's attention fractured completely. The two men who'd actually taken Julian were dead now, eliminated in the chaos of Julian's escape, taking whatever direct evidence existed with them. Sergei believed the trail had gone cold in his favor. He hadn't accounted for what Julian himself remembered. Julian's recovery continued under Dr. Elena Marsh's careful, discreet supervision, the physical injuries healing steadily while something considerably more complicated unfolded beneath the surface. Elena documented every session with the specific clinical precision of a woman who understood that trauma rarely surfaced in straight lines. "Tell me again about the room where they kept you." Elena's voice stayed gentle, patient, giving the 8-year-old boy in front of her all the space he needed. Julian's flat, controlled composure, the same hyper-vigilant calm he'd shown Maren that first night, cracked slightly at the edges whenever this specific question arose. It was dark. There was a metal door. 2 men mostly. Sometimes a third voice on the phone. A third voice. Elena kept her tone carefully neutral, though internally something sharpened. "Do you remember anything about that voice?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his small hands twisting together in his lap. It sounded familiar, like someone I've heard before, but I can't remember where. Elena documented the fragment carefully, cross-referencing it against nothing yet conclusive, but filing it away with the specific professional instinct that told her this detail mattered considerably more than an 8-year-old's traumatized confusion might initially suggest. Meanwhile, Maren's careful 3 days of normalcy ended on a Thursday. It was her day off. She sat in the spin and dry on 4th Street, a depressing cinder-block building that smelled permanently of bleach and stale cigarette smoke, watching her scrubs tumble in the industrial dryer through the scratched glass door. The rhythmic thump of the machine was the only sound in the otherwise empty laundromat, the kind of grey Thursday afternoon that made the whole city feel abandoned. She'd almost convinced herself the danger had passed entirely. The bell above the entrance door chimed. Maren glanced up from her phone out of habit rather than concern, expecting another tired customer hauling in a laundry bag. A man stepped inside instead. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit. He wore a plain grey jacket, unremarkable, the kind of clothing designed specifically not to draw attention. But something about his face made every hair on the back of Maren's neck stand on end. A specific, unsettling familiarity she couldn't immediately place, the particular way his eyes swept the empty laundromat with the practiced efficiency of someone confirming exactly how alone she currently was. He didn't approach a machine. He didn't check quarters or laundry baskets. He simply stood near the entrance, watching her with the specific, patient attention of someone conducting an assessment rather than waiting his turn. Maren's pulse quickened. The nurse in her, the specific instinct trained by years of reading danger in emergency room hallways, recognized something wrong in the stillness of this man's posture before her conscious mind could fully articulate why. She thought, suddenly and with devastating clarity, of Julian's voice in her car that stormy night. A fragment of something he'd mentioned in passing during the drive. Something about a voice among his captors that had felt strange, familiar in a way that unsettled him. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. A traumatized child's confused impression. But looking at the man now standing near the laundromat entrance, watching her with the specific, calculated stillness of someone deciding exactly how to handle a loose end, Maren understood with a sudden, sickening lurch that whatever had happened to Julian that night was nowhere near finished. The man took one step closer. Maren's hand slid slowly toward her phone. The man took another step forward. Maren's fingers found her phone in her jacket pocket. moving with the specific, controlled calm of a woman who had spent years managing crisis situations without letting panic show on her face. She didn't dial, not yet. She kept her eyes on him, tracking his movement, calculating the distance to the door behind him and the emergency exit near the folding tables. "You look lost," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This place doesn't get much foot traffic." The man's expression didn't change. He studied her with the specific patient assessment of someone checking a detail against a mental file rather than making conversation. "You're the nurse. The one who found the boy." Maren's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." His voice carried no threat in its tone, which somehow made it more unsettling. "I just need to know what he's told people, what he remembers." Maren's mind raced through the fragment Julian had mentioned that night in her car, the detail she'd dismissed as confused trauma, now landing with devastating new weight. She thought of the voice he'd described. Familiar, recognizable. This man wasn't here about ransom, he was here about exposure. Maren's hand moved fully into her pocket, her thumb finding the phone's power button by feel alone. She didn't pull it out. She didn't need to look at it. 6 years of muscle memory from calling for backup during ER emergencies took over completely. "I need to grab my laundry." She said it with deliberate casualness, already backing toward the folding tables near the rear exit. "If you'll excuse me." The man's stillness broke for exactly 1 second, the specific micro-hesitation of someone recalculating whether to escalate immediately or continue the more careful approach. That second was enough. Maren spun and pushed through the emergency exit door, the alarm blaring loudly into the empty afternoon as she sprinted into the parking lot behind the building. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She ran to her Honda, threw herself inside, and locked the doors with shaking hands before finally pulling out her phone. She'd memorized the number without meaning to. 3 days of trying not to think about it had somehow burned it permanently into her memory anyway. She dialed. It rang once before a voice answered. Not Dominic's, but the cinderblock man's low, immediate baritone. "Where are you?" No greeting, no hesitation. 4th Street laundromat. There was a man. He knew about Julian. He knew I found him. "Stay in your car. Doors locked." "We're 4 minutes out." The line went dead. Marcus Reyes and a full security detail arrived in under 3 minutes. 2 black SUVs sliding into the parking lot, with the specific coordinated precision of men who had trained extensively for exactly this kind of rapid response. The grey-jacketed man was already gone, vanished before their arrival, but Maren's detailed description, his face, his careful stillness, the specific phrasing he'd used, was enough for Marcus to radio directly to Dominic within minutes. Dominic arrived at her apartment 40 minutes later, his controlled composure carrying a new, sharper edge that hadn't been present during his first visit. "Describe him again." Every detail. Maren recounted everything. The grey jacket, the unremarkable face, his specific question about what Julian remembered. Dominic's jaw tightened with each detail, something crystallizing behind his eyes that carried the weight of a devastating realization taking full shape. That night, in the private study on Crestview Drive, Dominic sat across from Julian with none of his usual controlled distance, his voice carrying a gentleness Marcus had rarely witnessed from him in over a decade of service. "I need you to tell me about the voice again. The third one." The one on the phone. Julian's small hands twisted together, his flat composure finally, fully cracking under the weight of a memory he'd been unconsciously protecting himself from processing completely. It sounded like Uncle Sergei. The words landed in the study with devastating, absolute finality. Dominic went completely still, 15 years of trust collapsing in the space of 4 words spoken by his own son. He confronted Sergei that same night, the specific brutal weight of betrayal, carrying none of the controlled calm Maren had witnessed in his previous encounters with her. Dr. Elena Marsh's documented sessions, cross-referenced against financial records Marcus's team pulled overnight, assembled into an undeniable case within hours. Years of quiet positioning, careful embezzlement, disguised as operational expenses, and finally, the devastating confirmation that Sergei had orchestrated his own godson's kidnapping to seize the empire he'd spent a decade believing he deserved more than the man he served. The confrontation ended with the full, brutal weight the world Dominic operated in demanded, absolute and final, in exactly the way 15 years of misplaced trust required. Maren learned only the barest details afterward, delivered by Dominic himself with none of his previous performed control, simply exhausted honesty. It's over. Julian is safe. Completely, permanently safe. Weeks passed. Maren's life slowly re-established its own rhythm, except now with the undeniable, persistent presence of two people she'd stopped trying to remove from it. Julian's recovery continued under Elena's care, his hypervigilance gradually softening into something that looked, increasingly, like an ordinary 8-year-old's resilience, laughing at cartoons, asking endless questions, the specific slow unclenching of a child who finally, fully believed the danger had passed. Dominic's visits to her apartment became less about debts and considerably more about simply wanting to be there, though neither of them named that shift directly for weeks. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when Maren opened her door to find him standing there, with no crisis, no envelope, no black card wedged in the frame. Just himself, and slightly behind him, Julian, holding something carefully in both hands. The boy stepped forward, presenting a crumpled foil granola bar wrapper, with the specific solemn formality of a child returning something precious. I kept it. His voice carried none of the flat hypervigilance from that first stormy night, replaced by something warmer, something that sounded, unmistakably, like a child who had chosen his own family beyond blood. You gave it to me that night. I kept it the whole time. Maren knelt down, taking the wrapper carefully, something in her chest tightening with an emotion she hadn't let herself fully name until this exact moment. Thank you for keeping it safe. She looked up at Dominic, standing in her doorway with none of the calculated authority from their first devastating encounter. Simply a father, simply a man who had spent 15 years defining himself entirely by what he protected, finally standing in front of someone he wanted to protect, for reasons that had nothing to do with debts owed. I'm not here to offer you anything tonight. His voice carried genuine, unguarded honesty. I just wanted to see you. Both of us did. Maren looked between them, the boy she'd pulled from a storm without a second thought, and the man whose entire dangerous world had somehow, impossibly, made room for genuine warmth she never expected to find inside it. She stepped back from her door, not because a debt demanded it, because she'd decided, deliberately and entirely on her own terms, exactly what she wanted. Come in. If this story kept you holding your breath from that first bus shelter to this final open door, if it reminded you that the smallest acts of kindness can lead us exactly where we're meant to be, subscribe right now because we are not finished. Share this with someone who needs it today. Like this video, drop your city below, and turn on notifications because the next story is already loaded, and you are not ready for what's coming.